Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 74. Just one piece of channel admin for today, and the eagle-eyed amongst you might have spotted that the HMS Caroline has moved its position on the 5-minute guide list. So instead of being C-class this week and HMS Caroline next week, it's going to be C-class this week and then a whole string of other ships with HMS Caroline toward the end of January. And the reason for that is because flights around Christmas time are completely extortionate, and of course HMS Caroline still exists. So I thought rather than do a sort of desk-bound 5-minute guide, how about actually going to the ship and doing a live, quote-unquote, 5-minute guide, a bit like we did for HMS Victory. So I'm going to do that, but obviously I'm going to go at a time when the flights aren't eye-wateringly expensive, so I'm going to head out there in end of January. It'll be about a day trip, to be perfectly honest. Anyway, on with the video. The questions this week are taken from a bunch of revoiced videos and the guide to the Lion-class battle cruisers. Graham Dempsey asks, what would the implications be if HMS Royal Oak hadn't been sunk in Scapa Flow? Since she was the most modernised of the R-class, would she have seen interesting service, or would she have been largely on convoy escort duty like the rest of the R-class? Well, one of the interesting things would have been that, as some of you may remember, my great-uncle was on the Royal Oak, unfortunately, at the time that it sunk down in the engineering compartment. But if it hadn't been sunk, there's every possibility he might have been having a guest spot on the Drydock. So there's that, I guess, given how incredibly long-lived that generation of my family seemed to be. But anyway, realistic scenario in which Royal Oak survives. So we know the Germans had some problems with dud torpedoes at the time, and according to the Admiralty detailed investigation, as well as later analysis, the first torpedo that hit didn't do all that much. The second torpedo could have been survived, and it was the third and fourth torpedoes that did the ship in. So let's take a sort of a most plausible survival scenario. So Royal Oak gets hit by one torpedo, everyone thinks that's an internal explosion, go back to sleep. Then it gets hit by 3 more torpedoes, but this time torpedoes 2 and 3 are duds, and only the first torpedo of that second salvo detonates. So everyone at this point is very aware that there's a submarine. What quite happens to U-47 after that is really relatively immaterial, whether it gets chased off or sunk. But the point is, Royal Oak is now damaged but still intact, so it's going to have to go into dry dock for a few months for repairs. Now, the reason it was in Scapa at the first place was because although it had been relatively well modernised in 1937, it was kind of an update to existing systems more than a full-on rebuild modernisation like Warspite, Queen Elizabeth or Valiant or Renown. But anyway, the reason it was in Scapa was because its engines were on the verge of giving out, and it was a sub-20 knot battleship, which, to be fair, a lot of the R-class tended to be in the Second World War. But if you've got it in dry dock for several months, because you have to patch up all these torpedo holes, you might as well either update or repair the engines. So let's assume that she comes out of the dry dock with at least maybe a 21, 22 knot top speed. Maybe she's not going to hit the 23 knots that she could before, but she's of a useful battle speed. Now, one of the major refits that she actually had was modern anti-aircraft guns, albeit not that many of them, as well as a HAX-3 anti-aircraft control system, which is a surprisingly modern AA fire control system for a ship of her age. Rather oddly enough, she also had above-water torpedo tubes added. You can see them in the picture here. They are that weird double hatch forward of a turret on either side. So, don't know quite what the purpose of those were for, but never mind. Now, given this is the start of the war, and again she's in dry dock for several months, she might have seen a few more 4-inch anti-aircraft guns slapped on there. She already had 4 twin mounts, but they might put another couple on just for good measure. Now, with an unusually decent anti-aircraft suite for an R-class battleship, as well as hopefully some now working engines, she would be quite useful in a number of roles. Yes, she probably would see a lot of convoy escort duty, and in so doing, she might then bump up some other ships to other duties. So, say, for example, Malaya might be bumped up to Mediterranean Fleet duty, or even at the time of Bismarck sailing, maybe Royal Oak would be escorting the convoy instead of Rodney. Now, whether or not that means Rodney's part of the home fleet and ends up at the Battle of the Denmark Strait and changes the fate of the Bismarck right from its first encounter, or whether Rodney's off doing something else, and as a result it's Royal Oak and King George V that have to face off against Bismarck, is really too much of a coin toss to hypothesize about. But anyway, she definitely would be used in convoy escort duty a fair bit of the time. However, as the most modernised unit, and especially with a decent AA control system, I suspect she would have seen a fair bit of service in the Mediterranean, as especially once Queen Elizabeth and Valiant were knocked out for a while, but even before then, various elements of the R class were used in the Mediterranean in operations alongside Warspite and other ships against the Italian fleet. So she probably would have been there using her anti-aircraft suite to help defend herself against Italian and later German aircraft. Given that they block moved pretty much all the operational R-class over to the Indian Ocean for a while to play tag with the Japanese, she would have ended up there as well. I suspect that where you see Resolution and Ramillies popping up a lot in operations against Vichy French forces, you probably would have seen Royal Oak substituted in there whilst one or the other of the other two was back on convoy escort duty, because again she would be the most useful of the R class, so she would have popped up in all those various small situations. So yeah, for an R class she probably would have had quite the active and interesting service career in lots of secondary theatres, and as well as Mediterranean service. Almost certainly would have ended up off of D-Day, because, well, a lot of warships ended up off of the D-Day landings. So in a lot of ways it is, yes, definitely a pity that she was sunk at the time that she was. Chris Hopwood asks, would the Germans still have built the Bismarck if the Washington Naval Treaty had never existed, and the UK had built the G3 and N3, the US the Lexington, South Dakota, the Japanese Tosa, and Amagis, etc.? Now, if that had happened and the standard armament of pretty much everybody's battleships was 16-inch, with the exception of the N3s running around with their 18-inch guns, the Germans would probably have been fairly stupid to build something along the lines of Bismarck with quote-unquote only 15-inch guns. That's not to say that Bismarck's 15-inch guns weren't good. They were pretty powerful, but at the end of the day, it's a 15-inch gun. If everyone's rolling around with 16-inch guns, you're probably going to look a bit silly. So what I suspect they would have done would have been something that would have looked somewhat like a hybrid of the Bismarck design and the H-39 design. The H-39's considerably larger overall scheme, not tremendously different from Bismarck, so the overall appearance and other features of the ship's speed, protection, secondary AA battery, etc. are probably not going to be too much different. I don't think they would have gone straight to an H-39 size hull, given the problems with shipbuilding design experience in terms of major warships that they had in between the war. The Bismarck class were already pushing it quite extensively in terms of what they were able to do. So I suspect you probably would have seen something like maybe a Bismarck hull or a slightly enlarged Bismarck hull, but not quite the same as the H-39. I mean, that still puts the displacement roughly in the zone of some of the early 1920s era ships. Obviously, they could have been a lot more open about that displacement, but they would also almost certainly have gone with some kind of 16-inch weapon to match everybody else. DD Russian asks, how would the Battle of Jutland have gone if Jellicoe had gotten the correct information about the High Seas Fleet leaving port, i.e. the miscommunication between British intelligence and the Admiralty had not occurred? It's one of these weird things where there's potentially quite a number of major effects, but also a number of fairly major issues that aren't addressed at all by this particular change. Now, one of the larger overall things is that by the end of the day and going into the night, Jellicoe was very skeptical about the level of intelligence that he was receiving from London, in part because of this particular miscommunication in the first place. So you could argue that even if everything goes exactly as it did historically up till that point, if Jellicoe had the correct information from British intelligence in the first place, it's much more likely he would have paid more attention to the incoming intelligence reports that were being generated by London during the evening, which could either have led to some kind of night action or to the Grand Fleet being positioned to block the German fleet's return at the dawn of the next morning, both of which would have been pretty disastrous, albeit that you could well argue the daytime morning action would have been very disastrous for the High Seas Fleet. Quite how the night action would have played out is a little bit more of a coin toss. Now, if we go back to when Jellicoe receives this signal and sets out, he's not going to set out particularly much earlier, but what he is probably going to do is proceed south a lot faster, because now he knows, and hopefully Beatty would also know, that they're not expecting to run into just the German battle cruisers. They are fully expecting the High Seas Fleet to be out there, which means that hopefully, well, you can always hope, but Beatty might issue some orders to, say, 5th Battle Squadron to try and give them a heads up as to what his plans are, but that's probably a bit of wishful thinking given it's BT we're talking about. But anyway, Jellicoe's probably going to press south a bit faster. He's going to probably detach 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron much earlier to try and link up with BT, because he's going to understand that there's every chance that BT will run into the High Seas Fleet, at which point BT needs as much firepower as he possibly can get. Now, if 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron under Admiral Hood is detached earlier and proceeds at full speed with the Grand Fleet following up quite closely behind, then that potentially changes the run to the south considerably, because the 3 Invincibles show up, join BT's squadron. They know how to operate with BT, unlike 5th Battle Squadron, but it also means that the a slight advantage in numbers that the British have goes way, way up. Now, admittedly, they are the oldest battle cruisers, but as Invincible established during its brief foray at Jutland, those 3 had just finished training with the Grand Fleet in gunnery, so their gunnery is going to be much, much more accurate. That's probably, to be honest, not going to save Queen Mary, because 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron would fall into the rear of the line, which means that the whole target misidentification part that let Der Flinger have open season on Queen Mary is probably still going to happen, and obviously the Invincibles as well as Indefatigable are still quite vulnerable to piercing shot, because, well, they're not particularly armoured at all, still armoured to the level of armoured cruisers. But you've got Von der Tann and Moltke now, instead of fighting New Zealand and Indefatigable, which is roughly an even fight, they're now going to be fighting against the 3 Invincibles as well. And with those 3 all having pretty good gunnery, there's a possibility that Von der Tann, Moltke, possibly even Seydlitz, are going to get battered to the point that they're not able to meaningfully land shots and accurate fire before Indefatigable gets hit and obviously blows up. And even if Indefatigable gets hit and does blow up, because that happened relatively early in the engagement, there's still a fairly good chance that Moltke, Von der Tann and Seydlitz are going to be on the receiving end of quite the accurate and battering barrage from the 3 Invincibles, which could potentially cripple or knock out one or more of them, which could turn the run to the south into a much more even exchange. Now, of course, the big elephant in the room is what exactly happens with the High Seas Fleet Grand Fleet confrontation. That is the part where I said this intelligence might actually change all that much, because although Jellicoe will be in a position to engage somewhat earlier, most likely, the simple fact of the matter is that how that particular engagement went down was in large part due to BT just flat out not telling Jellicoe what the heck was going on. And Jellicoe had to make a series of informed guesses, albeit they turned out to be very well placed informed guesses and probably about the best he could have done. But nonetheless, the main advantage that the British would have at this point would be that there would be significantly more daylight, which means there's more time to force an engagement. Now, if BT does his as original timeline trick of just not telling Jellicoe what exactly is happening, then you probably expect something roughly similar to how the historic Battle of Jutland goes down, possibly with, given that the death ride of the battle cruisers now will probably include significantly fewer battle cruisers, it may well be that the Germans might lose some or more, or possibly even all of their battle cruisers, since there's a lot fewer of them to focus fire on. But if Admiral Hood, who's obviously been operating with Jellicoe for a while, does in fact sort of circumvent BT and quietly signal Admiral Jellicoe as to what's going on, then there's the potential for a much closer action, much more prolonged action. And given the way that the engagement was actually going at the time that she called the battle turnaround to get away, that's probably not ending well for the high seas fleet. But again, counterfactual, there is every possibility as well that Shear's mass torpedo boat assault, which he ordered, may pay off better, may pay off worse. Better visibility means they might get more accurate torpedo salvos off, but at the same time might also be more accurately targeted by the British ships. Whether Jellicoe chooses to turn away, as historically, to preserve his fleet or not is another question. He probably will, but he has more time during the day to force a re-engagement. So there's so many butterflies. As I said, you could have got everything from goes pretty much as historically, but with an additional battle the next day, all the way up to completely different change of both the run to the south and the general battle. Scott Drone Silvers asks, can you address the midship main battery turret placement in terms of the thought process that led to this development? I must admit I've never been a fan of Q turret with its limited firing arc, but it certainly was a common feature of capital ships during World War I. So the reason for the amidships turret poking up in all sorts of navies, as you can see here with the Italian Conte de Cavour class, but also on British ships, the various 13.5-inch gun ships and some of the battle cruisers, on a number of German ships, and also on things like Texas and New York, basically comes down to the desire for firepower, but combined with the level of technological development for turrets in the First World War. Initially, during the sort of first and second generation dreadnought period, you had the fact that you had ships like, say, Dreadnought, which were carrying 10 12-inch guns, and the South Carolina, which was obviously all centerline with 8 12-inch guns, but effectively the first-gen Dreadnoughts tended to have a broadside of 8 guns. The Nassau's as well, although they used the hexagonal turret layout. So when it came to building the second generation of Dreadnought, there was a desire to increase firepower, because of course bigger is always better. But at this point, the twin turret was still pretty much the only main battery turret you could go for. Triple turrets were not really a thing in the sort of very early part of the second half of the 1900s, sort of 1906, 1907 design period, which meant that if you wanted more firepower, you needed more turrets. Now, although the South Carolina had, of course, proved you could do super firing pairs, the British were somewhat against this due to the vulnerability of the sighting hoods they had in their turrets from being vulnerable to overpressure. But regardless, in many other nations where this wasn't so much the case, the problem was that, as you can see with the Conte de Cavours, when you make a super firing turret, you have to increase the barbette height by at least the height of the turret in front of you, possibly more. And barbettes have to be very well armoured, which means they're heavy, which means that adds an awful lot of extra weight to your ship, plus obviously you're moving a very heavy turret and barbette even higher up in the ship, which affects stability. So unfortunately, you couldn't do an Atlanta-style or Dido-style triple stack super firing turret, although that was actually considered for one of the prototype designs for HMS Dreadnought, believe it or not. And so this basically meant you had to find somewhere else, preferably at deck level, to place a turret. And since you'd occupied the forward part of the ship and the aft part of the ship, and battleships compared to things like cruisers tended to be relatively short for their beam, there wasn't really the space to do a Megami or Miyoko style 3 turrets up front and 2 turrets at the back arrangement, which basically left the middle of the ship. Because in the middle of the ship you had your bridge, you had your funnels and superstructure, but being a battleship that was going sort of 21 to 23 knots at the time, your overall machinery levels were not quite as great as you might find on a battle cruiser, and so it turned out there was enough space if you cleared away some superstructure to stick an extra turret or two in the middle. And that's what happened. I mean, the principle had generally been worked out with the offset firing turrets, things like the Invincible class, Von der Tann, etc., in the first generation of dreadnoughts and battle cruisers. So sticking a midships turret seemed to make sense, as it meant you could lose wing turrets. So say with Dreadnought, instead of having 2 wing turrets, you could have a single centerline turret. You'd still have the same broadside, but you'd save the weight of one whole turret and its barbette. Now, the triple turret did start to make an appearance during the latter part of the second generation Dreadnought and early first generation Super Dreadnought era, but the triple turret, as you can see here, was found on Italian ships in limited quantities, obviously on Austro-Hungarian ships and on Russian ships. But although it was considered on British, American, and German ships at the time, it was felt that the complexities and additional weight of individual triple turrets were not worth it, as well as the more vulnerable aspect of, obviously, if you get hit on a triple turret, a greater portion of your armament is knocked out if you have a similar number of guns. And for the Japanese, of course, they wanted to engage as many ships as possible, so they needed many individual turrets rather than a couple of larger ones. At the time as well, you also had to deal with the fact that naval gun technology was advancing considerably in size very rapidly, and that meant that given that you needed a larger turret, as you can see again with this design, I chose this specifically because it has a mixture of twins and triples, you can see how much larger a triple turret is. So a lot of the arguments went along the lines of, well, if we can get a triple turret of a given caliber, say 12-inch in, why don't we instead use that same barbette ring size to put in a twin turret of a larger caliber, like 13.5, 14 or 15-inch guns? And it would usually be this argument that won out. But again, if you want a salvo of 10 guns, or potentially more, that means you're still limited by the same height and stability issues, which means you're still going to end up with a midships gun turret. So it's only as you go into the second generation of Super Dreadnought design that the triple turret has advanced to a point that the major navies feel confident enough to use it, but also that gun caliber has begun to stabilize somewhat to a degree that using 3 slightly smaller guns as opposed to 2 slightly larger guns is seen as a beneficial trade-off than not one that's going to come back and bite you 2-3 years down the line when someone launches a ship with an even larger main armament. So this is why you see the US Standard class go from their immediate predecessors with the New York and Texas with 5 twins to the Nevadas with 2 triples and 2 twins, and then on to the main standard class with 4 triples as they're carrying 14-inch guns. Now with the Queen Elizabeth, the opposite approach was taken, where they bump it up to 15-inch with twin turrets, and interestingly enough, the Queen Elizabeth, as originally proposed, would have actually had 10 15-inch guns in a similar layout to the British 13.5-inch gun dreadnoughts with an amidships Q turret. So you would have had the 10 15-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, but that was sacrificed for extra machinery to make them go faster, and by the time the Revenge class came about, it was the same layout but on a smaller hull. So you could have seen the Q turret persist even into the second gen Super Dreadnought designs if the desire to make the Queen Elizabeth go that much faster hadn't been there. And of course, as we mentioned, the Japanese, although matching the number of barrels on the American Standard class with 14-inch armament with the Fuso and Issei classes, went with, well, 2 amidships turrets, precisely for the reasons that we indicated earlier. Craig L. Young asks, could you explain the different Royal Navy flags? For example, there's what we in the US call the Queen Anne's flag, which is with the red field, and this is the Royal Navy Merchant Fleet's flag, but you show pictures of warships carrying that flag. Has the meaning of the flags changed over the years? So yes, covered this in part in a question on Royal Navy flags and rankings back in one of the earlier dry docks, so I'll briefly cover it here. But basically, what it was that back in the Elizabethan period, the fleet was divided into 3 squadrons, the vanguard, the middle, and the rearguard, pretty much the same as had been done with medieval armies on medieval battlefields. But these were assigned squadron colours, which were red, white, and blue. But contrary to what you might expect given the Royal Navy's flag today, it was in fact the Red Squadron that was the sort of top ranking one. You then had the White Squadron, and the Blue Squadron was the most junior. This created the ranks of admirals of red, white, and blue, and these were distinct ranks. So you could have, after 1805, around the Battle of Trafalgar period, 10 different ranks of admirals, starting at Rear Admiral of the blue, working up to Rear Admiral of the white, Rear Admiral of the red, then Vice Admiral through those structures, then Admiral through all those structures, and then finally up to Admiral of the fleet. And between the Elizabethan period and 1805, the only rank that didn't exist was Admiral of the red, as you went from Admiral of the white straight to Admiral of the fleet. So, as this was the preeminent and generic Royal Navy flag, that meant if you were part of the Red Squadron, you would fly the Red Ensign. If you were part of a unit that was commanded by an Admiral of the Red, you would fly the Red Ensign. And if you were a Royal Navy ship that was not assigned to a particular squadron, if you're on general duty, you would fly the Red Ensign. So the only times you fly the White Ensign or the Blue Ensign would be if you were part of a squadron that was commanded by an admiral of that particular rank. However, that doesn't immediately mean you should go out and point at pictures of the Battle of Trafalgar, for example, and say, oh, well, they should all be flying the Red Ensign, because you see, Nelson, when he died, was a Vice Admiral of the White, which meant that he would be flying the White Ensign, and so the ships under his command, Victory and those following, would thus be flying a White Ensign. So the predominance of Nelsonian imagery, especially around the Battle of Trafalgar, gives rise to a common misconception that the Royal Navy was flying the White Ensign commonly back in the Napoleonic Wars, when in fact it wasn't. Now, this all changed in 1864 when they decided that having multiple colours of flags for the Royal Navy was a bit silly, and a committee got together and it was eventually decided that the White Ensign would become the ensign of the Royal Navy, quite possibly due to the Nelsonian connections. The Red Ensign was then made the flag of British Registered Merchantmen, which is why it's now seen on merchants and not warships, and the Blue Ensign was denoted to be the flag of Royal Naval ships in service that were not warships at the time. So that would be things like fleet supply ships, ships that hadn't been commissioned yet, ships that were in the reserves, and the various entities that fall under those categories could have all sorts of different badges applied to the Blue Ensign. But it was also determined slightly later, a few years later on, that the Blue Ensign could be used by ships that were in public service for the British colonies that were armed. So ships that were on colonial duties, sort of in South Africa, India, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc., etc., these would also fly the Blue Ensign, as they were not part of the Royal Navy, but they were held to deserve some form of British ensign signifier. And that, in actual fact, is the origin of why a number of ex-British colonies actually have a blue ensign style background to their flags. Now, some countries have since changed their flags, obviously, but if you look at flags like Australia and New Zealand, the basic flag is still the blue ensign with additions to it, and this is because, well, all the ships that were sailing around predominantly in their waters for a considerable period of the colonial period were all flying blue ensigns. Graham Baxter asks, speaking of the Dardanelles, do you think the original plan could have forced the Ottomans' surrender if the captains and admirals involved had damned the torpedoes as intended and charged all the way to Istanbul? It's a difficult question. I mean, there were quite a number of ships that were being sunk by the mines. Granted, they'd nearly got through the worst of the minefields, but they didn't know that at the time. And the minesweepers that they had kept retreating under fire because they were mostly manned by civilians. So none of that was particularly good. In theory, the overall strategic picture wouldn't have been changed if the Allies had just kept feeding pre-dreadnoughts in until they'd cleared a path, mainly by contact detonation. And again, in theory, it might have worked. The chances of them actually being allowed to continue that are pretty slim, though. And it would have been an absolutely horrific amount of casualties. It's one of those things where, sort of, yes, in theory, if you were sort of like in the God's eye view of an RTS game, you might think, yeah, okay, fine, I'll just sacrifice this bunch of obsolete ships I don't particularly need anymore, and kind of kamikaze your way through and knock out your enemy. So yes, in theory, it's entirely possible they could have done that. In practice, I'd be very hesitant to suggest that any admiral willing to keep throwing people at it, given what they knew at the time, would have been entirely sane. There were some views at the time that thought the victory was quite close, but and yeah, theoretically they might have been right, but practically speaking, most people were sort of looking in askance a little bit at the number of ships that had been sunk or damaged in a single day. Now, where there could well have been a victory was actually a much lesser known bombardment. So a lot of people know about the bombardment in sort of February 1915, the naval attempt to force the Straits, and it didn't work, which is pretty much what you're asking about. What a lot of people don't realise, however, is that back in 1914, back when the British and French first declared war in November 1914, then there was actually a bombardment that had a much greater chance of success, because at that point the guns were, although the defences around the Dardanelles had been significantly improved by bringing in German expertise and crews, a lot of the guns were still obsolete, a lot of the ammunition was still lacking and relatively exposed, and the minefield was nowhere near as dense. There were 3, maybe 4 lines of mines present at that point, as opposed to the 10 plus that there were by the time the February 1915 attempt was made. So, with considerably more vulnerable and considerably less effective gunfire from the forts, there's every chance that the civilian minesweepers, if they'd had them there at the time, might well have managed to make their way through the minefields and clear a path. And even if they didn't, if the Allies had committed the kind of pre-dreadnought forces that they had in February 1915 committed, then there's every chance they might have forced the Straits and forced the surrender of Istanbul at that point, there and then. I mean, as it was, they went in with 2 battle cruisers and 2 pre-dreadnoughts, but if the French had gathered up their pre-dreadnought force, maybe bring in the armoured cruisers from the Mediterranean fleet and any pre-dreadnoughts that they had floating around in the Mediterranean fleet as well, if that November attack had been all of those pushing up, then to be honest, even if they didn't have minesweepers with them, they could have forced through the relatively paltry number of mines with the loss of maybe 2 or 3 pre-dreadnoughts, which could have well have been sustained, at which point you would have had bunch more pre-dreadnoughts, a couple of battle cruisers, and a squadron of armoured cruisers, and whatever else wanted to come along for the ride, quite comfortably forcing their way through into the Sea of Marmara and up to Istanbul. Now, granted, the Germans have just brought in Goeben and Breslau, but Goeben and Breslau's chances, well, Goeben basically, its chances against a dozen plus ships, capital ships, are not very good. So that particular assault, if it had been slightly better planned and had a bit more impetus behind it in the first place, might well have carried the day through to Istanbul. But as for the February one, I doubt that it could have been done at a cost that would have been acceptable. Mtume Umrani asks, from a documentary I've seen describing the three-turret system on US Navy World War II ships, regardless of there being a three-turret system with the turret divided into three sections for each gun, how did the explosion on number 2 turret on USS Iowa kill the entire turret's crew when the turret hit at Mers el Kabir to Dunkirk didn't have the same effect? So there are two reasons for this. One is that the French quad turrets, both on Dunkirk and Richelieu classes, were divided by an internal bulkhead to effectively turn them into two separate twin gun turrets, and that was specifically put in place to avoid losing the entire turret crew to an incoming shell hit. As a result, that bulkhead was somewhat thicker than the internal dividing bulkheads in the Iowa class's 16-inch turrets, because although those were designed to afford a degree of safety and separation for the various gun crews, they were never designed with that kind of situation in mind. So as a result, even though the Dunkirk's gun turret had significantly smaller guns, the internal bulkhead was about twice as thick as the 3/4-inch STS steel that was separating the Iowa class's guns. Then the second factor is that the Dunkirk was hit by a 15-inch shell, armor-piercing shell, which meant that you've got a few dozen kilos of explosive going off in one side of a gun turret, which, as we said, has a relatively, well, a thicker bulkhead, and that explosion has a vent, which is the hole that the shells just arrived through. Now, conversely, you've got several hundred kilos of explosive going off when the propellant charge in the Iowa's turrets went off. Bearing in mind it's made up of multiple bags. Now, I've seen various reports. Some people have said that they were reduced charge service bags, which would have meant about 250 pounds total of explosive going off. And others just say that it was a propellant charge for a 16-inch shell, which would have been it would have been over nearly 600 pounds of explosive. But either way, even at the absolute minimum, assuming that it's reduced service charge bags at £55 a piece, you're still talking about an explosion that is well over 5 times as powerful, possibly more than 10 times as powerful, and it's detonating in an area, as we said, with thinner internal bulkheads, and unlike the hit on the Dunkirk, it doesn't have a natural escape through a pre-existing shell hole. And all of that means that the chances of it rupturing the bulkheads in the other gun housings are pretty much guaranteed, and all you need is to rupture the bulkheads enough to get the fireball through, and everybody inside is unfortunately toast. And now on to Patreon questions. Veenvet asks, what did the US Navy learn from Operation Crossroads that would have had a practical application and wouldn't have been figured out anyway? For example, I doubt you'd have to nuke a whole fleet of warships crewed by press-ganged goats to find out what a lethal dose of radiation is. There were actually a surprising number of findings that came out of the Able and Baker tests that they weren't expecting. You see, obviously, nuclear technology at that time was in its infancy, and although there had been a number of test detonations on land, quite a lot of the instrumentation and such that they'd put up had been marked by simple notations such as did not survive test, or completely broken by test, or potentially has ceased existence on this mortal realm. So there was an expectation of quite a lot of destruction by atomic bombs, understandably, especially given that they could look at and see what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But how that would affect warships was another matter entirely. They genuinely didn't know. They had some guesses, but they wanted to find out exactly what would happen, because this would influence all sorts of things, from how close a fleet should sail in formation to whether or not fleets are even viable. Sort of, would a large nuke knock out an entire fleet? Would it knock out only a few ships? What would the resultant damage to other ships be, etc.? And so what they found was actually quite surprising, and that was that the lightweight superstructure, and of course anything exposed, would be severely damaged or destroyed at fairly long ranges, and lightly built ships would be quite severely damaged regardless. So you look at something like USS Saratoga. The Lexington class as battlecruisers were never the world's most heavily built ships, and as an aircraft carrier she was even more lightly built compared to a full-on capital ship. So when she was subjected to atomic bomb blast, even though the distance was greater than some other ships closer in, she effectively crumpled up and sank. Not the hull itself, but various bits of the hull and the superstructure just went fold. Kind of like an atomic game of poker. But the battleships in particular, and some of the heavier cruisers, showed a remarkable degree of resiliency in that whilst some of their lighter upper works did get destroyed, unless you were something like the poor old USS Arkansas, at anything other than absolute point-blank range, the ships themselves actually survived physically intact. You look at something like USS Nevada, for example. Now, whether or not the crew would have survived is an entirely different matter, but then it does turn out that sort of a foot thick of armor steel plus intervening bulkheads and a lot of ocean water does provide a reasonable amount of radiation protection. So on some ships, depending on the range, obviously crews would have died fairly soon of radiation poisoning. In other ships, the radiation levels in the depth of the ships were actually survivable at surprisingly close ranges. And although obviously there was an awful lot of shock damage that could have crippled systems or potentially knocked them offline for a while, there, and I mean, it sounds very fatalistic, but there was almost a certain attitude of, well, actually, at anything other than point blank ranges, if an atomic bomb goes off in the middle of a fleet formation, the crew will probably survive long enough to get the ships back into port, at which point we can hose the ships down, pull the crew out, put new crew in, and sail off with relatively minor repairs. And that also transmitted shock through the water was significantly more damaging to ships, albeit shorter range than airburst stuff. So, yeah, overall, what Crossroads actually told the US Navy and other navies was that fleets were actually much more survivable in the face of atomic warfare outside of point blank hits than had been thought going into it, which probably influenced to a great degree whether or not fleets, as we understand them, continued to be built. Because bear in mind, in the 50s and 60s, there was the attitude of, well, we'll just nuke everything, and as it turned out, ships were actually relatively hard to nuke. The slight irony of it all, of course, was that World War II had seen the ascendancy of the carrier, and yet in the era of atomic warfare, if a fleet was sailing around and somebody detonated a fairly large nuclear warhead a couple of miles away, there was every chance that, say, something like an Iowa might well survive and continue to be combat operational, whereas something like an Essex or a Midway would probably be out of action, if not sunk. Bill Cunningham asks, what would be your top 10 picks for the ugliest non-French warships of all time? Ooh, your words, not mine, but let's go with it. In no particular order, the Italian monitor Far di Bruno, which looks for all the world like an air traffic control tower, with a gun turret with a frying pan stuck on top of it, all mounted on what appears to be a shed that got flooded and floated out to sea. USS Choctaw, which again appears to be a pair of factory funnels, a small Virginia-style ironclad at the front, and somebody stole part of a paddle steamer and welded it onto the back. I mean, I understand there was a little bit of kit bashing going on in the American Civil War, but honestly, this thing looks more like it's about to rise up 90 degrees out of the water and transform into Optimus Prime's uglier cousin. Post-conversion, I'm afraid HMS Blake doesn't win any beauty prizes. I mean, look at that. You could literally split this picture down the middle. Front half is relatively nicely profiled post-war British cruiser. Rear half is you appear to have stolen the half of a carrier or possibly a freight ship. Please give it back. And what are you doing with it? Then USS Long Beach. I mean, come on. IKEA called. They want their Kallax cube back. Then I'd have to go with the refit Fusos. There are ways of making pagoda masts work. This is not it. Obviously, as we mentioned last week, Juan Carlos I. Upon further thinking, the thing that offends me even more about this ship now is actually if you look at the side of the hull, you can see where it's darker grey. Now, if you imagine the hull lines followed that line, it would actually aesthetically look like a pretty good small carrier. But they've added this monstrous extra deck or two in the lighter grey further up, which just ruins it. Then I've got to say HMS Scorpion and Wyvern. With the breastwork panels up, they don't look terrible. Once their breastwork panels, which you can see there half obscuring the turrets, are down, it's like, well, it's like someone cut out a good 3/4 of the ship. It's like full-size stern, full-size front, raft with 2 turrets on it. It's just no. The 3 Lord Clive class monitors that had the misfortune to be stuck with one of HMS Furious's guns as well as the spare. Yeah, just look at that. That's just no. Just no. No, 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 no. The Russian cruiser Askold has seen here, which appears to be a large collection of funnels that have taken to sea. And lastly, I think I have to say the Zumwalts, for 2 reasons. One, looking at them, I appreciate the nice clean lines and everything, but it looks like somebody's got partway through designing a ship using styrofoam and then forgotten. And 2, look at the facing part of the bridge and tell me if you don't see a rather gormless face just looking forward going, James Sean Moore asks, it's obvious that vessels such as Kamchatka and Porter have incredibly unlucky / cursed. I was wondering if you'd come across any other vessels with a similar questionable history. Well, in the terms of amount of bad luck, compared to something like Kamchatka or Porter, very few ships survive that many run-ins with bad luck. But one few that come to mind would be things like CSS Hunley, one of the few ships to have a 1-to-3 kill-to-death ratio. And the other one that comes immediately to mind is the German Gneisenau. Always in the shadow of Scharnhorst and seems to absorb all the bad luck that was intended for Scharnhorst. Almost every time it went out to sea, it came back damaged in one way, shape, or form. Nearly got sunk a couple of times, and as a result of one of the last attempts to sink it, which badly damaged it, ended up just being scrapped and used as a block ship. Especially when you compare that to the career of Scharnhorst, which took a fair bit of a battering itself over its career, but always seemed to bounce back in a way that Gneisenau never actually managed. John C. Driscoll asks, if the Confederate States Navy had taken delivery of the Laird's rams, how likely is it that with those ships they might have managed to break the blockade in one or more ports? I think this has been covered previously in an earlier Drydock. I certainly remember expounding on it at some length. So there's a link in the description to a spreadsheet that has all the Drydock questions, I think up to episode 70, so you might find a more detailed explanation there. But to cover it in brief here, yeah, they probably could have broken a blockade on a port, especially working together. They've got their 4 guns. Now, granted, they're 9-inch guns, so you might think, oh, well, the monitors have 11 and 15-inch guns. Yes, but these are high-velocity guns, not the sort of low velocity smashing types that the Dahlgrens are. These guns could quite comfortably punch through pretty much any armor that the Union ships could put up against them. And for all the criticism I said in the terms of them being quite ugly, they're still significantly better seagoing ships than most of the US monitors and faster to boot. So if these two had shown up fully armed and prepared, then yeah, I mean there's precious little many of, if any, of the wooden warships could have done to stop them, considering the performance against Virginia, which is significantly less powerful than these ships. And if they'd chosen a single port and gone for that, then it's fairly likely that any ironclads the Union Navy has present there wouldn't be in a place to stop them. They've got 4.5 inches of rolled back armor, so they are at reasonable ranges for the time period. They're still going to be proof against most shot that can be flung their way. Now, the later heavier charges on the 11-inch Dahlgrens and the standard charges on the 15-inch can punch through this thickness of armor, but only at relatively short range. Basically, these ships can, especially with their speed and maneuverability, sit at a range beyond the ability of the Union ironclads to penetrate their armor. Meanwhile, their guns can penetrate the Union ironclads' armor with a relative degree of ease. That's not to say it'd be an easy fight. They would be very outnumbered, but of course, so that they can make themselves relatively invulnerable to damage, at least in the most armored sections, and they can kill anything that they can double team. So, yeah, they can break a blockade on a port for a bit, certainly, but they will take damage into so doing, and I suspect that by the time they've gone in to take on repairs, the Union would have closed the port again, and they probably would have brought in sufficient numbers of ships such that, even individually powerful as they are, they would just be overwhelmed. And NickBoy302 asks a triplicate question. If you go to each major navy's respective drawing boards in 36, what procurement refit choice would you make to prepare for World War II, e.g. force hoods, refit, redesign Bismarck, etc.? 2, have you watched the anime High School Fleet? If not, do you plan to? And 3, between the Australia Squadron and the Imperial Japanese Navy, who was in a better position to intercept von Spee in 1914? If I'm going with one major design choice per navy, I'd obviously send Hood into refit for the British. For the Germans, I think, as I said before, I'd probably just focus on building more Scharnhorst with twin 15-inch, so that I can then also upgrade Scharnhorst and Gneisenau to 15-inch. For the French, I would actually try to accelerate the construction of the Richelieu class, in large part, to be perfectly honest, because this is me with foresight, because if they are complete by, or near enough complete by the time World War II starts, and therefore complete by the time World War II gets fully going, the chances are that as full-on capital ships, they are probably going to be deployed to the areas where they're most likely to meet enemy capital ships, which more than likely means that they're going to end up in or near British ports, which makes them far more likely to be able to join up with the Free French and continue the fight into World War II. For the US Navy, I'd go and find whichever idiot in the Bureau of Ordnance screwed up the designs of the Iowa's turrets and quietly push them off a bridge so that the Iowa can get its originally intended armament. And since I'm only going to count that as a half because it's just affecting a ship's armament rather than the ship design as a whole, I'm also going to find whoever's responsible for the design choices that screwed up the Mark 14 torpedo and put them off the same bridge. For the Japanese, I would probably tell them to find another anti-aircraft gun, anything that isn't the 25mm, and potentially, if I'm allowed, again, if I count that as a half, potentially also tell them don't bother converting Shinano to an aircraft carrier. I mean, yeah, it's going to get sunk by the Americans nonetheless, but at least it'll absorb a few more bombs and torpedoes if it's completed in its battleship form. And who knows, without the delay converting, you might even see all 3 of them sent to later, and that would be interesting. And for the Italians, I'd probably tell them to get their radar sorted and stop deprioritizing and messing around with it, because the ability to see at night or in bad weather was rather instrumental in a number of Italian defeats. So if I'm trying to be in favour of the Italians, that's definitely a major thing that I'd change. In terms of the high school fleet anime, I don't think I've ever seen it, and I don't really have the time to be picking up new animes at this point. And in terms of who was better positioned to intercept von Spee in 1914, the Imperial Japanese Navy by a country mile. They're infinitely closer, given that the von Spee starting out at Tsingtao, but also the Royal Australian Navy, the Australia Squadron ceased to exist in 1911. The Royal Australian Navy, although it has the battle cruiser HMAS Australia, they only have 2 light cruisers and a few destroyers otherwise. So whilst Australia is more than a match for Scharnhorst or Gneisenau on their own, 1 battle cruiser and a couple of light cruisers versus von Spee's entire squadron fresh out of the dock, fresh out of port. Yeah, they stand a decent chance, but they're going to be taking a lot of damage at the very least. Whereas the Japanese, although they don't have any full-on battle cruisers at this point, with Congo still under construction, they have capital ships and they have quite a number of armoured cruisers. So if they want to just do a stand-up armoured cruiser versus armoured cruiser fight with the odd pre-dreadnought or dreadnought thrown in, the Japanese are quite easily going to crush von Spee's squadron. And as I said, they're in a position to actually get in there and stop him before he can really get out of Tsingtao. Dave Collier asks, after Jutland, the Royal Navy redesigned their projectiles to the much improved Greenboy shells. Specifically, what design changes did they make, and how much of an improvement were these new shells? So, British shells at the time of Jutland had a number of issues. One of which was that their actual build, the sidewalls and the cap and everything, wasn't the strongest. So when they hit at angles that weren't perpendicular or near enough, they had a tendency to break up. Although that was very much a situational thing, depending on the exact angle and what they were hitting. Additionally, their body, the explosive part, was made of explosive known as lyddite. Now, lyddite was an incredibly powerful explosive, which was why it was in there. However, as it turned out, the lyddite was incredibly sensitive, in fact, far too sensitive, to the point that a lot of the heavier shells, when they hit their targets, they'd explode near enough on impact, or very, very shortly thereafter, even shorter than the fuse setting. And this effectively turned them into slightly lower yield, high explosive shells. Now, the sheer force of the impact and the slight delay to detonation did mean they still did a fair bit of damage, and when they struck dead on, sort of near enough perpendicular angles, they were still capable of doing some penetration, but they weren't able to do anywhere near the damage that they should have done. And this was a major problem. So with regards to the Greenboys, they actually had a number of things that they changed. Firstly, they tried to change the fuses to make them more reliable, with a certain degree of success. They also redesigned the shell itself, so the new shell was fractionally lighter but fractionally longer, and built a lot stronger, which turned out to be much better for armor penetration. So there was a slight increase in overall armor penetration and a significant increase in armor penetration when you were hitting at angles beyond about 15-20 degrees. But the single most important change they made was replacing the explosive. So lyddite was replaced with a thing called shellite, which was a mixture of lyddite with a much more, a much less sensitive explosive, which combined to make an explosive payload that was overall a lot less sensitive to shock. And this improved the shell's potential massively, as it meant that the shell would punch through the armor in the first place, and which, to be honest, the older shells could do to reasonable degrees, we've covered, but A, it was more likely to penetrate, but B, it would not detonate until it got into the depths of the ship that it was hitting, and thus it would do considerably more damage. There was a lot of experimentation as to the exact ratio of the new explosive mix, because the more inert the mix got, the more closer it got to 50-50, obviously the more stable it was, but it also meant that the fragmentation that was produced by blowing the shell up, which was one of the main ways of causing damage, was significantly less. So they gradually balanced it more and more towards the lyddite component, but I think eventually it was like something like 60-40 or 70-30, something in that region, that gave the stable explosive component, but also a fair degree of energy to the explosion, and therefore a lot of fragmentation and internal damage. And all of this was borne out by some firing trials, which these diagrams are from, which were done on obviously the captured SMS Barden. And that proved that the shells were actually quite capable of punching through the German armour and doing considerable damage once they exploded inside. And that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Drydock, and indeed this is the last Drydock of 2019. Next week's Drydock will be the Patreon Q&A edition. I expect that's going to be a fairly long one, but oh well, what can you do? And so thank you very much for listening, if indeed you still are here, and I hope to see you again in another video.